Hello, sisters and brothers, comrades and friends. Welcome once again to Live Mike with Mike Palisak. We are broadcasting live from the National Capital Region of Soviet Kanakistan here on December 10th, 2020. And this week's guest, we have a longtime and frankly legendary organizer with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. John Clarke has spent most of his life organizing and fighting for working class people and for people struggling with poverty, to really raise the bar for everyone. And it's a great honor to have him here on the show this week. John Clarke, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Mike.
So, first question. How do we save the world? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I figure if you don't know, then probably nobody does. So I'm really counting on this answer here, comrade.
Okay, well, to sum it up, I think that I think we're at an absolutely incredible time at the moment. I always sort of imagined that late capitalism was going to be a rough experience, but I don't think anyone anticipated what's actually unfolding. We have this incredible biomedical crisis. It's unleashed, or to be more exact, it's intensified an economic crisis of global proportions. It's absolutely incredible, and hanging over it all is the fact that they're frying the planet. So we have a system of greed and irrationality. When I was 17, 18 years old, I used to think that the solution was a socialist revolution. I'm now 66, and I don't think that anymore. I know it for a fact. So, I think that really is the situation. Is we must change the nature of the society we live in. We must transform it, and that's an ongoing project that a number of us have set our minds to over the years. But the urgency of it has never been greater. I think this is a time for bold action. I think this is a time for fighting demands, and I think this is a time for radical visions of different societies in a way that I've never seen before in my life.
Well, it's pretty clear that the capitalist system is not working for us. It's working for a handful of billionaires. It's certainly not working for the working class. It's certainly not working for the poor. It's certainly not working for the underdeveloped world, or the overexploited world is probably a better way to put it. It's certainly not working for the environment. And now we're reaching the point where the existence of the human species is threatened. The existence of our biosphere is threatened. So I think you're right. Capitalism is reaching its limits. But what does that look like, the socialist revolution? What does it look like building a new society?
Yeah. There's no question there's immense problems that stand in the way. But I think this is a period in which, it's sort of axiomatic that social consciousness lags behind being. It's true that people are not always, people faced with a situation like this may, to some extent, seek to hang on to what exists and resist the notion of radical change. But it's also a period in which incredible leaps in thought, and I don't mean by individual people, I mean by masses of people, can really occur. And I think we're seeing the glimpses of that. Who would have imagined that when the Minneapolis police rather routinely killed a black man on the streets of their city, that it would unleash the kind of reaction that we've seen around the murder of George Floyd. It produced something absolutely incredible. It produced actually a social mobilization that is reckoned to exceed that which occurred in the 60s and 70s. So these are incredibly volatile times, where people are under attack, but where the possibility of just absolutely explosive developments occurring are. Now, I'll be the first to agree that in that situation, it isn't enough for people to just come on the streets and be angry. What's required is really clear political ideas to be introduced into that talk about a different kind of society and actually develop strategies and tactics to take us in that direction. But like we've never had raw material like this to work with before. I mean, I think this is a period where it's sort of you can go from small organizations with relatively little influence to big organizations with enormous influence. You can go from relative passivity to explosive acts of social resistance. And I mean, even in the most, you know, the polls, the opinion surveys that they do, which capture only a pale glimpse of what's going on in society, but they themselves are registering the fact that people are massively discontent. I see an Ipsos Reid poll in Canada that talks in terms of 70% of the population saying that fundamental changes are needed in Canadian society. I mean, that's incredible. The Black Lives Matter explosion that occurred in the United States and has spread has affected the thinking of millions of people. So, I mean, I do think it's an exciting time. I think it has immense dangers, but the times with the greatest dangers are also the times with the greatest possibilities. So I feel it's a time for boldness and it's a time for optimism.
And you've spent your life uh, leading bold action and organizing grassroots movements, and I, I I actually can't even count how many demos and occupations and other things I've been with you on, and we don't even live in the same city. Um, but right back from the Mike Harris years, you've been taking direct action against capital and for exploited people. Um, what are some of the big lessons you've learned about let's say direct action? What's your biggest lesson about direct action?
Well, I mean, I think direct action is a vital tactic. Um, and there's sometimes been a kind of a notion that direct action is a kind of a small group of people doing outrageously provocative things, but direct action can occur on a mass scale too. I mean, the the trade union movement in North America owes its great leap to people actually seizing factories, taking over, occupying workplaces. Um, and the people that did that probably a week before they did it would never imagine they'd done anything like that in their lives. Um, I mean, I think um, those kinds of disruptive tactics are of enormous importance. And I mean, of course, the working class fights in various contexts. Um, the most obvious form of direct action is to withhold your labor, to go on strike. That's the option for workers that are, for the most part, workers that are unionized. But there are corresponding forms of direct action that can be employed by people that don't have that tactic available to them. Um, Piven and Cloud, the two US commentators on the anti-poverty movements in that country, made the observation that the main way in which the poor can have political influence is through their ability to create crises by disrupting institutions. And so I have to say, been involved in disrupting institutions for a while before I came across that quote, but it seemed to resonate. It seemed to be something that was really important. And the stuff that we did, it didn't just happen. I mean, it was modeled on earlier struggles. It was modeled on struggles that were taking place in other countries, and it was modeled on the unemployed movement of the 1930s. So I think direct action, you can't make a kind of you can't introduce into it a kind of a dogmatism where it's the only method available, but it's a vital component. Basically, I think the system can get used to the fact that millions of people don't like them. The system can even get used to the fact that millions of people might come out on the streets and protest, but the system can't deal with a working class that is prepared to shut it down. And that's, I think, the great strength that we have in terms of at least the great tactical strength we have in terms of how we can act.
And certainly, the Ontario Coalition of Against Poverty that you've worked with for decades has been all about direct action and grassroots movements to challenge attacks on working class people.
Yeah.
What are some of the challenges to that kind of organization?
Well, I mean, the truth is that the OCAP years, because I now find myself an older person who's focused in a slightly different way and is not no longer an organizer with OCAP. Um, I mean, I think I think the challenge that we faced is that we were engaged in a largely defensive struggle, not achieving levels of mass mobilization, but significant levels of mobilization, um, in a period where we're dealing with an agenda that is gaining ground, and we're fighting this defensive action in the face of it. We haven't been in a situation where we're able to go on the offensive in the way that was available to people in earlier periods. And it always strikes me that we got started in 1990 when the neoliberal agenda was already a significant factor in people's lives. Uh, and we've now have a 30-year history. If if that 30-year history had gone back for the previous 3 decades, then I have no doubt that we'd be talking in terms of the social programs that were established, uh, the housing that was built, the things that were achieved. But we fought in a very different context, and it was in some ways a tough period to operate in, sort of the dog days of the neoliberal assault. Uh, but I think we're maybe now in the cusp of a period when we can think in different terms, when we're no longer fighting that kind of a defensive struggle, but the possibilities of really going on the defense on the offensive are really posed, and that's what's I think really exciting about this time.
And we seem to be at a turning point in world history. Obviously, this pandemic is putting all kinds of stresses on everyone. Of course, it's hitting the poorest hardest. Um, well, what would you say about that?
Well, it is. I mean, it's an absolutely devastating period in that regard. And I mean, in a country like Canada, which even amongst the many of the you know the highly developed capitalist countries, the imperialist countries, has not by any means had the worst of it. But I mean, there are so many places in the world where the economic fallout of the thing has been absolutely incredible. You see the migrant workers in India, you see the townships of South Africa, you see some of the things that are going on in South America. You see the kind of effects that are happening there, absolutely devastating. But even here, I mean, even with the measures that they've taken, you're starting to see people face incredible situations. Food bank use in Canada has absolutely exploded. So many people are living on the edge at the moment. The homeless situation has never been as bad in the city of Toronto as it is at the moment. Um, and they're starting now to move to evict people by the thousands from their housing, people whose only real offense is that they suffered economic dislocation because of the crisis and simply don't have the means to pay the rent. And they've set up an online process of evictions that makes a mockery out of any concept of natural justice. And they're just throwing people out of their housing. And a very courageous movement has emerged around it that's challenging it, but it it as yet doesn't have the broad base of working class support, although they have a very significant and powerful mobilization amongst working class poor tenants. They don't have the kind of generalized support from the working class organizations that's required. But I mean, this is a period when I think we're going to see attacks that we just can't even contemplate uh, coming down on us. And that's going to produce an enormous reservoir of anger, and it's going to create incredible possibilities in terms of mobilizing.
over the last few days, there's been a reemergence of the mass movement in Portland, and this time around defending families against evictions.
Yes.
Um, we're seeing barricades going up, actually preventing bailiffs and police from evicting families from
Yeah.
their homes. People are actually holding ground again, not letting the police in. They've declared an entire neighborhood an eviction-free zone.
Yeah.
Um, I think these are the kind of mass anti-eviction struggles that we can expect to see more broadly as this crisis continues. I mean, we all knew that they weren't going to let people go on forever uh, without paying rent, even if
Uh,
they made an emergency or allowances in an emergency.
yeah.
Now, the time's coming to pay the bills for people, and a lot of people are finding that they can't do it because we faced the probably the one of the largest economic crises since the Great Depression. Millions of
Yes.
people are out of work. Millions more are staying home, have been or are not able to work because of pandemic conditions. And in this atmosphere, they're demanding people to start paying up again when they
Yeah.
simply can't. So
Yes.
so it seems that there's a tsunami of evictions coming,
Yeah.
and I think Portland probably gives us a good example for what we need to do
Yeah.
to stop people from being thrown out of these homes. Um, but I think you were touching a little bit earlier on the tenants union, but what kind of work needs to be done, just say in Toronto, to get
Yeah.
that movement on the ground ready to
Yeah.
take this on?
Yeah. I mean, we've seen incredible rent strikes and actions earlier. There's a very thriving and important tenants movement in the city of Toronto, and it has taken an incredibly bold opposition forward against the against the evictions. But what's really required, I think, is very, very serious levels of solidarity action being taken. I mean, I think the trade unions should recognize that this is an absolutely pivotal working class fight. Uh, if they're able to evict tens, hundreds of thousands of people in the coming period, that's going to be an enormous defeat. It's not only going to lead to immense human suffering, but in terms of the balance of class forces in this society, it's going to be a devastating defeat. And there needs to be, a very, very serious level of solidarity, support, mobilization that's taking place. And it's going to, we need, of course, to advance demands. The demand must immediately be to restore the moratorium on evictions. Uh, Taking that off in this period as the second wave bites is outrageous. We need, of course, demands around housing, social housing demands and such things. But what we also need is the capacity to mobilize on a mass basis to block evictions. The lessons of the 1930s are before us. I mean, in that period, there was by no means uniform victory. But if they were going to evict a family, they reckoned with the possibility that the unemployed movement of the day, through its block committees, would mobilize a crowd of hundreds, if not thousands, of people to stop that from happening. And evicting people became a huge police operation. And we need to return to that kind of tradition. We need to create a situation where evictions are not immediately possible, and because there's mass working class defiance, and evictions are a very key and immediate fight. But it points to all these things. Um, the the great explosion was around racist police brutality. Uh, there needs to be mobilizations to ensure that racist police just can't come into people's neighborhoods and do the things they did to George Floyd. There needs to be mobilization in solidarity around the workplace struggles that take place. We need to completely change the scale and the nature of working class mobilization. I mean, I'm always struck by the fact that in the period we've been in, the last number of decades, you have a situation where a kind of a class compromise arrangement emerges in the post-war period, where um, you know, working class living standards are increased during the economic boom at the end of the Second World War. But in return, there's an agreement that strike struggles will not be generalized, they'll be compartmentalized. There's a recognition that social mobilization will be limited. Uh, there's nothing was signed on paper, but the truth is that that was the agreement that was reached. During the neoliberal years, we've seen a situation where basically the other side has ripped up the deal. Uh, but for the most part, our organizations have played by the same rules. Uh, they play by the rules of a deal that's been revoked by the other side, which is a bit silly. Um, but the neoliberal attack, notwithstanding periods like Mike Harris or Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan, when everything seemed to intensify and speed up, the neoliberal period, by and large, has been relatively incremental in terms of the attack on working class living standards. Cumulatively, it's produced incredibly major defeats, but it's been a relatively incremental process. I don't think we're in an incremental period now. I think, the model of trade unions that are quite top down in terms of how they're organized, with a membership that is demobilized for most of the time, is not a winning proposition. The notion of working class communities that are relatively passive in the face of attack is no longer a winning proposition. So I think we've got to really, it's not going to come from the top, it's going to come from the base. We've got to rethink that whole concept of what social resistance means and what the possibilities of social resistance are. I mean, I talk in terms of socialist politics. I think those socialist politics are vital, but we won't achieve them through preaching. We'll achieve them through the conditions in which that consciousness can change on a massive scale is conditions of mass struggle. And we have to create those conditions of mass struggle. We have to bring out those conditions of mass struggle.
You raised some interesting points about, I guess, the post-war compromise, and how that played out. Of course, in Canada was with the Rand formula, where it was decided by a famous strike where Justice Rand intervened and settled it. To give a quick summary for people that don't know, this became the basis for modern trade unionism in Canada, where the employers would finally recognize the right of unions to exist. You'd have a grievance procedure, that sort of thing. Automatic dues check off, so the union wouldn't have to go around and try and collect dues by themselves anymore. But for all of these things, we basically traded our right to strike whenever we wanted. Before, when strikes were just generally seen as illegal, even before, it didn't stop workers from going on strike. Uh, but really, as you mentioned, this post-war compromise was a control system. It was an attempt to put straitjackets on workers' actions, and I think a rather effective attempt. Uh, but it played another role within the mass organizations, the massive trade unions, is it created a bureaucracy and a professional class of trade unionists who are now they're actually playing the role of often being a brake on the workers' movement, saying, "Oh no, obey now, grieve later. Don't take action on the work floor. Don't walk out. Oh, that strike would be illegal. We'll get in trouble." All of this, so it became a mechanism for the working class to police itself. Um,
Yeah.
and now, as you pointed out, the post-war compromise has been thrown out the window. We don't have the right to strike anymore. When we use it, they take it away. We don't have the right to organize and mobilize en masse. They fight us through the courts. We don't even have the right to have our collective agreements that we do negotiate upheld, because the bosses just run roughshod over them, break them the day after they negotiate it, and say, "Go ahead, grieve it. We don't care."
Yeah.
So obviously, this is disempowering for our movement, but we tend to cling to this idea. The ruling class is trying to attack the Rand formula because they've thrown it out the window, as you said. So, like with the right to work laws that we're seeing in the states, anything to sort of weaken the union movement. Um, how do we break out of this straitjacket?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's been the challenge of the recent decades. Is
It's
as a,
certainly
as a,
been my challenge.
yeah, it's only been your challenge. I sort of noticed some of that, but I mean, I think this last period has been one in which, as I've said, I think the deal was thrown out the window. Um, but um, but I mean, first of all, you have a very entrenched leadership that is very committed to this legalistic approach and this, uh, relatively collaborationist approach. Not to say that every trade union leader is a vile collaborator, but it's a system that has it's a system that has sort of required this sort of self-policing of the working class that you speak of. But I mean, I and that doesn't immediately change. But I think that this period makes it makes that model incredibly irrelevant. Uh, I think it had some credibility in a period where, the bosses were taking away this and the state was taking away that at a relatively gradual pace. But I think that period now starts to come to an end. I think the enormity of the crisis that's unfolding at every level, fed by, you know, the pandemic, and this may be the first of a series of global pandemics, um, fed by a deep crisis that isn't just a question of the pandemic causing lockdowns. That's the official discourse. But in fact, the economic crisis was already underway in 2019. It was already gathering speed. It's much deeper malaise of the capitalist system than that which was tipped over the edge by the pandemic. And over it all, the climate crisis and the broader ecological crisis, it's not just a climate crisis, it has other elements to it, is producing such dislocation and beginning to intensify that level of dislocation in people's lives that it produces just this incredible situation. And so the notion of working class organizations that are looking for a limited compromise when there's no compromise to be had becomes incredibly irrelevant in that situation, which I think really does raise the possibility, not of jettisoning the trade unions at all, but it raises the possibility of a revival of a rank and file movement that has immense possibilities. And there have been times when that's happened. I mean, in over in over in Scotland, I think of some of the ways in which the shop stewards movement at the end of at the end of the First World War played out, and the power that was actually, the direct power of workers that was brought into play in that situation. Other models like that exist. I think there's the possibility of a real rejuvenation within the trade unions linked to community-based working class struggle in a way that hasn't happened before. That doesn't make it immediately happen. It doesn't make it a guaranteed result, but it's a possibility that I don't think we've seen before in our lifetimes.
And one of the things that's so pernicious about this sort of straitjacket is that it actually tells workers what they want to hear, and it tells trade unionists what they want to hear. It tells
Yeah.
workers that don't worry, there's a system and it's fair, and we're gonna represent you and get you the best possible outcome. And it tells trade unionists that they have the power to take on the boss and get justice for workers and so on. And I get it. You know what? It feels really good to stand in front of an arbitrator and argue a case and get somebody's job back and get them their back pay.
Yeah.
Those victories feel really good.
Yeah.
So it's hard to see that as a straitjacket of the class struggle
Yes.
until I think we reach these moments like where the status quo becomes impossible and
Yes.
everything changes one way or another. And I think you're quite correct to point out that we're in one of those periods. Um, this pandemic is going to have long-lasting repercussions,
Yeah.
not just medically for lots of people, but economically for the entire system. And I said in one of my earlier shows, the ruling class will try to make working people pay for this crisis.
Absolutely.
Um, the
Absolutely.
tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in debt that have piled up, they're going to try to make us pay for that. And in
Yeah.
fact, we were already on the brink of a sovereign debt crisis before this happened on a national scale. Like, uh, I don't think it's quite hit home to people um, how precarious the entire system is, and it's literally standing on the edge of collapse at the moment. So, I think it's fair to say that there's going to be a massive wave of austerity following this
Yeah.
pandemic. Um, and we need to be ready for that. And I simply don't see people getting ready for it.
No, I think that's true. I mean, there are movements taken to the streets. There are things happening. It's not like there's no class struggle going on. There is a class struggle, but in terms of, I mean, we're a long way from what needs to exist, and we're organizing in the cusp of a desperate situation. That's true. Um, but I mean, I think you know there is always that possibility, and I would say in this situation, I'd elevate it to the status of likelihood. There's that likelihood of the explosive potential for mass mobilization. Uh, and those things come really quickly. I always think back to uh, a while before the Arab Spring. Um, I remember seeing uh, footage of somebody in Cairo trying to speak out publicly in the most repressive situation imaginable. And everybody's looking at him like he's a dangerous maniac. And then within the space of weeks, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, millions of people on the streets who think exactly the way he does and are acting exactly the way he does. And so we can't underestimate the incredible possibilities that exist. Now, of course, even movements of that strength uh, can be dissipated and can be diverted and can be defeated. So it's not just that I'm sort of like worshipping the notion of we get a million people on the streets and we've solved all our problems. That's not really the way it is. But that's the raw material for something that can really be taken forward. So I think there's a need to rethink left politics. There's a need to rethink the question of what kind of lead the left is able to give in this situation. Um, but but there are, of course, no. The immediate future is enormously unclear, but there are threads, and there's evidence, I think, of incredible possibilities, earth-shattering possibilities. And I mean, again, I mean, I keep saying this, but I'm in a sort of a lockdown situation myself, and it's incredible that I'm viewing so much of this through computer screen. But I've never seen anything like this in my life. I've never seen these kinds of possibilities. I think this is the most exciting time of my life. It's just absolutely incredible. Don't want to get self-indulgent here. It's just about my life, but 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 as someone who's hammered away at what sometimes seemed to feel like a brick wall. I mean, I feel there's a real possibility of a great big bloody crack in that wall, and it seems like remarkable.
I, I had the privilege of seeing sort of revolutionary situations up close a few times in my life. Um, one, I was back and forth to North Africa multiple times throughout the Arab Spring, and I was also briefly in Venezuela at the height of the Bolivarian movement. And one of the things that really stands out in those periods is the sudden thirst for knowledge and for ideas about how to move forward,
Yeah.
where you have millions and millions of people that have never been active in politics, that haven't really given it a second thought, and all of a sudden the world is bursting with opportunity and there's millions of people in the streets and everybody is looking for the way forward. And
Yes.
I've seen, I can remember, hawking socialist street newspapers on a street corner somewhere, and you'd have 500 people walk by you, and one person glance at you sideways, and wouldn't have a whole lot of interest. But do the same thing in the middle of revolution, and the material just disappears, and like people are desperate to get it. I can even remember um, in the streets of Caracas seeing people literally standing up on boxes, reading out leaflets to crowds because they wanted to try and digest information. Um,
Yeah.
so so these revolutionary movements happen, and all of this energy bursts forward, but without the organization to actually channel that energy, it's quite easily dissipated.
Yeah.
And I look I look now to the Arab Spring with heartbreak in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
because I saw that beautiful, magnificent movement up close. I was participated in meetings in towns under popular control. Um, I saw all of this, and I saw all of the possibilities in people's eyes and the hope for the future and so on. But when you look at a balance sheet of the Arab Spring, you know, we got a liberal democracy in Tunisia, or at least the beginnings of one, maybe. And that seems to be about it. Libya got utterly ruined. Syria got utterly destroyed. Uh, in Egypt,
Yeah.
you had the Muslim Brotherhood come to power, and they were in power briefly before the military was back in charge and the dictatorship was back.
Yeah.
In Morocco and Algeria, it was strangled before it could even start.
Yeah.
Um, and it seems to me that the difference is organization. Um, when you have those millions of people coming out looking for looking for a way forward, um, small organizations, sure, they can grow in leaps and bounds, as you said, in these periods, um, but you've got to have enough of an apparatus together to actually get that message out.
Yeah.
Um, I often think if there was like a revolutionary explosion here in Canada today, uh, where would it lead us? Would we have millions in the streets and then until it's dissipated and they regain control, or do we have the organization in place to actually, um, start to construct the new society that we need?
Yeah.
Um, and I think the answer to that question is obvious.
Yeah.
So what do we
Yeah.
have to do to get here?
Well, I mean, I think the weakness of the left, let me say the anti-capitalist left, uh, the weakness of the anti-capitalist left is probably the greatest danger in the period ahead. Uh, and I don't think there's a way to deny that or just get around it. Uh, I think what it's going to require to move forward is that we're going to have to that there's going to have to be some pooling of resources. There's going to have to be some very non-sectarian approach taken to trying to work together and give the lead we can, because we don't have a political organization in place in this country, and Canada is not unique in this regard, that is in a position to give that kind of lead in this period. And it has to be built. It's an urgent question. But I think I don't think there's one. I don't believe I could point to a political tendency that I say is the nucleus that's about to bloom forth. I just don't see that myself. I think it is going to require a level of cooperation, and it's going to require uh, not that differences need to be submerged; they need to be debated, they need to be fought out, but there's going to have to be a very high level of cooperation around advancing radical demands and putting them forward, and that kind of an approach. Um, and you know, I don't think it's by any means a very challenging situation, but I don't think it's a hopeless situation, because I think we do go from that, to use your image. We go from the situation where you stand on the street corner and hundreds go by. You're now in a situation where you've got dozens of people, if not hundreds of people, who want to talk about what is the solution, what are the ways forward, and that rather changes the political nature and the political possibilities. Yes, it's a grave danger, and I don't mean to minimise it, but I think it'd be wrong to see it's hopeless.
So on to a different topic. A lot has been said lately about the possibility of a universal basic income scheme
Right.
coming in, and you've been rather outspoken about this. Now, a lot of people are looking towards universal basic income as a way to solve all kinds of problems, to get past major issues of poverty in this country and so on.
Right.
Uh, but you, as someone who has been a leading figure organizing and fighting against poverty for decades in this country, have sounded the alarm and said, not so fast. Uh,
Yes.
what are your concerns about this?
Well, it's a huge question. Um, I mean, it's first of all, I think, necessary to recognize that in this period, um, people are scared, people are angry, people are hurting, and the notion of uh, a secure and a decent income is not a reactionary quest. It's something that really people gravitate towards. Um, but I think that the basic income project is nonetheless a very big mistake. It's a very big mistake for the left. I mean, I can understand why Milton Friedman liked the idea. I can understand why the Silicon Valley billionaires like the idea. Um, but I think for the left to embrace the idea of basic income, and frankly, at the moment, we're in a real dangerous situation where the main generalized demand of the left could become universal basic income. I think it's dangerous on a number of reasons. Um, First of all, I think it misunderstands what is immediately possible. Right? People say that during the pandemic, the CERB was brought in. People got $2,000 a month. It was by no means a perfect solution, but that's what basic income could look like right now. Well, I mean, Justin Trudeau just spoke before the Financial Times of London symposium and made very clear that that's not on the table in terms of what's going to happen. Uh, the the um, the steps, the reluctant and immediate steps to prevent mass destitution that the state took in the face of the pandemic lockdown is not the model for an income support system that's going to go on from here. Um, the income support systems that exist today are wretchedly inadequate, but they're wretchedly inadequate for a reason. Right? Income support is something that is paid by the state as a reluctant concession to ensure that social dislocation and social unrest are minimized. But at the same time, they want to make very clear that they make very certain they don't give people enough that they're going to have a viable alternative to the worst paying jobs on offer. Right. So if a basic income system were introduced tomorrow, the notion that it would automatically be adequate and it would automatically meet people's needs is false. It would actually be subject to the same austerity pressures and the same desire to drive it down as low as possible as any other system. So first of all, it's not just that there's this big payment that's going to make everything better that's just sitting there waiting for it to be introduced. It's a delusion. But the other thing that I think is really the big folly with basic income is that what you're talking about doing is, as I've put it, commodifying social provision. What you're now going to do is you're going to extend the concept of the cash benefit payment way out much further into the working class. When they did the Ontario pilot project, 70% of people who got the benefit were not people on social assistance. They were low wage workers. So what they're looking at primarily is a wage top-up system. They're going to extend social benefits out so that low wage workers get this payment. And what that's going to mean essentially is that low wage employers are getting a subsidy. From now on, low wage workers are going to receive their income largely from the tax revenues, which is to say, other workers who are slightly better paid are going to be through their taxes paying what used to be their wages. And the possibilities there for undermining struggles to increase the minimum wage and fight for living wages and workers' rights are enormously undermined. In 1795, in the village of Speenhamland in Berkshire in England, they decided that they were going to top up the agricultural workers' wages out of the poor laws, out of the poor law revenues. And what that did was created a situation where wages were driven down. Employers who paid just above that rate lowered their wages so they'd qualify for the top up, and it created this depressing of wages. And that's the obvious result of bringing in a wage top up situation. At the same time, what you're going to do is create a kind of uh, in the context of an agenda where austerity and privatization are being pursued. You're now going to extend the cash payment, and in that context, as the right wing political scientist Charles Murray advocates, the basic income would now not augment other systems of social provision, but it would replace them. So they're going to say to you, you want, where's my drug card so I can get some benefit, so I can get the medication I need? Well, you go and shop for it. How do I, what happened to my social housing? Well, it's been privatized. You're going to give the money now to a private landlord. So what you're actually doing is extending the cash benefit so that instead of fighting for expanded and improved public services, you're accepting everything as a cash payment. And that's something that lends itself to the extension of the marketplace and to the furthering of the neoliberal agenda. So I think on various levels, the approach of basic income is something that the corporate sector understands. There's this corporate front organization in Ontario called UBI Works, and they just brought out a report suggesting that basic income would, I don't know, basically create everlasting life. That it would lead to a massive increase in GDP. It would eliminate poverty. It would do all these wonderful things. But in there, there's this little passage that I came across that says that, but it would work the best if employers didn't have to pay for it, and if households paid for it. So what they're actually suggesting is that working people will pay the wages of poorer working people out of their taxes. So I think it's an agenda that has some radical pretensions. The idea of basic income has some radical pretensions, but essentially it makes its peace with the reality of the neoliberal agenda. And we need to challenge that agenda, not accommodate ourselves to it.
See, I see this slightly differently, in that I think basic income is an economic tool, and tools work very differently depending on whose hands they're in. A hammer can be a tool to make a nice piece of furniture in the hands of a carpenter, but it can also be a murder weapon for someone else. And I think you're absolutely right. A universal basic income scheme brought in under the capitalist system is not going to be sunshine and roses. It's not going to solve all of the problems that they're pretending it is, and I think it will open up avenues to all kinds of attacks, as you're right to point out. So I think, in the sense that, in an age of austerity, it will absolutely be used to attack living standards of the poorest people in our society. It will absolutely be used to force workers to pay the wages of lower paid workers through their taxes, rather than forcing employers to pay them by raising the minimum wage. And I think the things that you pointed out about, putting negative pressure, for example, on raising the minimum wage, like, what kind of fight will there be? What kind of mobilization will there be to raise the minimum wage when it's below that UBI level? I think those are all some very, very real points. That being said, there's some things about it that I really like. I think the idea of setting an absolute floor of income level for society is a radical idea that would that could change consciousness, because then we're not talking just about fighting to improve things for the least of us, but we're talking about a value question. of what is the floor, what is the minimum amount that we expect for human dignity. And
Mm.
I think those elements are why people are so
No,
taken by the idea.
it's true.
Um, but whether or not we'll see in the coming weeks and months and years if this is the direction that the ruling class actually heads.
Yeah,
It's clear that a good portion of them suspect it's the way to go. It's
yeah,
also clear there's major opposition to it.
yeah. No,
Um,
they're as divided as we are on the question.
yeah, but
Yeah,
I think what we should be aware of is that no matter what happens, um, it's not going to replace the class struggle.
no,
We're we're still going to have to fight for every little bit, and they're still going to use this system to try and screw us with every chance they get.
yeah,
So I do think it is kind of dangerous for us to be looking at this as some sort of panacea that's going to save us,
yes,
because it's not.
yeah,
The I think the entire history of capitalism tells us that they don't give up anything without a fight, and they take anything away the moment they get the opportunity to. And it'll be the same under UBI.
yeah. No, and I agree. And let me say that I absolutely think that the right to a basic, decent standard of living is something that we absolutely must fight for, and that means that the existing and necessary systems of income support that exist need to be challenged. We need to demand incomes above poverty levels for significantly above poverty levels that are for people that collect employment insurance, that people that are on social assistance, disability benefits, the scandalous abandonment of injured workers is a question that's got to be fought out, and we need a movement that doesn't just deal with that as an afterthought, but the raising of the rates becomes something that's actually fought more seriously. Um, and of course, the working class can't tolerate, the working class movement can't tolerate the levels of low wage, precarious work that exist and not challenge that. We need, but but employers have to pay for that. They have to pay that in the form of decent wages to people. We have to take up that fight. But the notion that we should draw a line in the sand about a level of income that we consider to be the right of working class people, I'm the last one that wants to put any opposition forward to that idea.
So so how do we put that forward without falling for the trap?
Well, I do think that we're not looking for the expansion of the cash benefit system. There are there are obviously income support programs that are absolutely vital for unemployed people, for disabled people, etc. And we have to absolutely fight to make those adequate. But primarily, the gains in working class living standards, where we can really make the improvements in working class living standards, where I think we can make enormous gains, are precisely, first of all, in the workplace struggles around and not just trade union struggles, but broader struggles around minimum wage, around employment standards, and those kinds of things have to be given full and massive support. But primarily, the big things that we need to fight for are massively expanded and free public services. So we need a healthcare system that isn't going to be overwhelmed by a pandemic, right? We need long-term care facilities that aren't privatized death traps. We need Dentacare. We need pharmacare. We need free transit. We need a universal childcare program that isn't a perennial, cynical, liberal promise, but is a reality. I mean, those things, those are the kinds of points where we can actually engage. And those are the kinds of things where we can demand the allocation of public resources in a ways that will make so much more difference to working class living standards and the quality of working class life. And moreover, push back the neoliberal marketplace and actually further not just a defensive, but a socially transformative agenda.
And what political party is putting that forward?
Um, That's a work in progress at the moment. I can't say that I'm seeing that advanced in the way it needs to be advanced, but I think it corresponds to working class reality and working class needs, and I think it's something that could be advanced, and it's something that needs to be advanced seriously.
Well, this is what I find interesting when you look at polling on issues. Um, you find that the population of this country is far more progressive than the political parties would have you believe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, as you said, 70% think we need a fundamental change in our society. The vast majority of people support socialism in Canada.
Yeah,
And yet we don't have a single major political party actually advocating socialism. Um,
yeah,
you know, the vast majority of people are in favor of bold action on the environment, of raising the minimum wage, of universal dental care and
yes,
pharmacare. All of these things that
absolutely.
you've pointed out, poll after poll after poll,
Yeah,
uh, says that this is what people want.
yes,
And even the parties on the left are somehow afraid to talk about this stuff, as if it's dangerous, that'll scare people away, or something like that. I,
yeah,
I don't understand the disconnect. Can you
yeah.
shed any of that light on this for me?
Well, there's at the moment. The two best examples of people that are leading this determined effort to maintain the credibility of the political centre are, I could say Joe Biden, but I'd perhaps be better to say Obama, uh, who's uh, who's become a sort of a who's become the spokesperson for the left is unreasonable, the left is unpopular, and then of course in Britain you have Starmer and the new right wing leadership of the Labour Party that are both committed to this notion that electability is based on clinging to the neoliberal centre. And I think it's, time to just recognize that it's not just inaccurate, but it's a fundamentally dishonest agenda. The truth is that for people like Barack Obama and Sir Keir Starmer, uh, the, uh, the great fear is not that left wing politics couldn't win an election. Their fear is that left wing politics could win an election. Uh, they are creatures, political careerist creatures of the neoliberal centre because that's where their bread is buttered. And they're determined to uh, preserve whatever credibility they can for the especially discredited neoliberal centre. But this is a period in which, look, if there are gains are going to be made, unfortunately, they're going to be made on the right or they're going to be made on the left. They're not going to be made by wretched bleating for a status quo that everybody hates. That's the obvious truth of the period we're in. So those and in the Canadian context, we have a social democratic party in this country, and I've always been struck as someone who comes from Britain that that it's a particularly bankrupt thing for social democracy in Canada to try to cling to the political centre because that space is already occupied by a robust Liberal Party. So it's a particularly glaring act of irrelevance to cling to the political centre for social democracy here. Uh, a bold alternative would, I think, would actually, and it wouldn't even have to be, you know, a clear-cut anti-capitalist alternative, but a bold alternative that went so far as actually posing an alternative to the austerity consensus would win massive support and create an enormous political opening, I might say. And that is happening for the reasons I outlined, but I don't think it's at all impossible that it's going to happen.
Well, I think it's inevitable at some point. I mean, these ideas have got to find a mass outlet. You can't have the major political parties being out of pace with the majority
No.
opinion indefinitely. At some point, these things are going to change up. Um, I'm just amazed that the left, I mean the parliamentary left, is still so cautious in these things. Like they're it's like they're still suffering hangovers from the McCarthy era, and they're afraid they're going to be called commies or something.
No, no, it's true. It's true. Yeah, I mean, they're, I mean, partly, I mean, you know, someone like, I mean, I think or a lot of the politicians within, we could say the NDP here, we could talk in terms of Labour Party. Uh, I think their own political futures are bound up with that precisely that conservative mindset. Um, and I also think they think in terms of you know their the notion of what's possible is not something that they focus on a lot. They're much more concerned with what the editorial boards are saying about them. So I think they have a very restricted view of things and a very conservative view of things. But I think the point is that they're completely wrong. I think that if the NDP in Canada were to, well, look at the last Ontario election. I mean, you actually did have a significant move to the right by the move to the left, excuse me, by the NDP. I wouldn't want to exaggerate it, but there was a significant change in terms of what was being proposed, and it actually did resonate for a period. Ford was looking quite worried. There was actually real possibilities. Uh, if that political development in the NDP had happened several years before, if they had consistently advanced a clear left message and they'd moreover used their own structures as a way of linking with community struggle and actually advancing a real alternative. I'm not predicting this is going to happen by any manner of means, but had they done something like that, I think the last election in Ontario could have played out entirely differently. Uh, they made a belated political tack to the left for tactical reasons, and that wasn't enough. But it resonated. It resonated with people. So I mean, we may not be in a position, those of us who take a fairly forthright anti-capitalist position, to advance a call that's going to resonate with sufficient people at the moment. But something. An intermediate position that actually advanced a serious set of strong demands for things to be done very differently around challenging the austerity consensus, that would resonate massively and would have incredible possibilities.
So you touched base a little bit about the Labour Party, and of course Starmer's um, agenda, which is clearly to root out the left
Yeah.
and drive them out of the party. Um, it's also quite clear that during the last election campaign with Corbyn at the helm, um, large sections of the party bureaucracy were actually trying to sabotage the campaign,
Yeah.
because you're right, they were more afraid of Jeremy Corbyn as prime minister than they were of Boris Johnson. Um, and I think that's likely the case in left leaning political parties uh, all over the world. Frankly, um,
Yeah.
this shift to the left isn't going to come without opposition, and the institutional bureaucracies in these organizations, they will fight back, including outright sabotage, to try and disrupt this agenda.
No, absolutely. I mean, in fact, the British Labour Party is the great example, because I mean, the big difference over there is that the Liberal Party uh, in Britain went into a state of faded glory early in the 20th century, and the main contender to the Tories has been a social democratic party. Now, I mean, I grew up with Labour governments, and I'm not romanticising their achievements by any manner of means. But the truth is that the base of the party and the relatively strong left on the party made it, from the standpoint of the British establishment, a risky proposition. And the whole idea was through the Blairite project, was to actually turn it into a safe understudy for the Tories, modelled on, in many ways, or very much like at least the Liberal Party of Canada, and that was what they were hoping for. And so what you got is a whole section of these horrendous political careerists who form up the majority of the PLP, or here we call the Parliamentary Caucus. And these people have their whole orientation and their career expectations based on being loyal servants of British capitalism. Uh, and so, yes, that's exactly why the apparatus of the party wasn't. It's all been documented. You actually get them quoted saying things like that when in the election before last, when Labour surged, they were actually talking in terms of how what terrible news this was, how devastating it was that the party they were supposedly working to get elected was doing well, was a disaster. Uh, they would far sooner see the Labour Party massively defeated than see Corbyn move into number 10 Downing Street. And that is in the particularly volatile and extreme situation of the Corbyn project and everything that's gone around it in Britain. But fundamentally, I don't think it's that different in amongst left parties throughout the world. I mean, left parliamentary parties throughout the world.
And I think the left often makes the mistake of thinking, "Oh well, they'll come around when they see how well we're doing, or when they see this is successful, or so on." Um, when in
Yeah,
fact the exact opposite is true.
yes,
And I've had experience with this in multiple organizations. But in fact, the better you do, the more they will fight you. The more they will
yes.
go out of their way to try and
No,
disrupt uh, a sort of radical left agenda from being successful, because
no, absolutely.
you're right, it is a threat to that to their whole outlook and political future.
No, well, that's true. I mean, and a comparable situation exists with regards to the bureaucratic structures within the trade unions that you talk about. I mean, they certainly don't want to see the trade unions destroyed. Uh, they don't want the agenda of the employers to totally prevail. But a radicalized, rejuvenated, democratized trade union movement doesn't look good for them either. That looks a pretty risky proposition in terms of where they are and their positions and such like. So yes, those brokers of the stalemate, the brokers of the compromise in society, they become an impediment, and as a layer. I mean, this or that person may change or modify or whatever, but as a layer, they become a definite problem a political problem an organizational political problem that we've got to address.
Yeah, and it's a, I guess it's a slow process getting there. I know radical lefties have spent decades trying to actually break through in a lot of these
Right.
organizations, and transform them, and hit all kinds of resistance. Um,
Yeah.
but I think often that mistake that's made, and I think it's the mistake that Corbyn made, was to think that they could be brought around, um,
Oh,
when in fact they were looking for the moment for the knives in the back.
No, well, and in fact, I don't think. I mean, in the British context, I don't think you can understand what happened by simply looking at how vicious the right was, how cruel the media was, how conniving the BBC was, and how hateful the British establishment was. Uh, you have to actually look at the weaknesses that existed on the left. I mean, I was over there in 2016 uh, when Corbyn was debating with this creature, uh, Owen Smith, who was put up by the party establishment to run against him for leadership. And he was like this kind of man that makes you want to take a shower if you're in his presence. I mean, he's this sort of like oily, manicured, hand gesturing, sort of practiced pharmaceutical lobbyist, as a matter of fact, was his background. And I mean, he's supposed to represent the Labour Party, as if he has anything to do with Labour. And so he's just having this debate, and he says at some point to Corbyn, Jeremy, I'm afraid I couldn't be part of your shadow cabinet, as it's called over there. I couldn't be part of your shadow cabinet because I'm afraid I don't have confidence in you. And I'm thinking, okay, Jeremy, this is your moment. This is your to tell him you wouldn't get a place on my shadow cabinet, you dog. And Corbyn replies, well, Owen, you'd be very welcome in my shadow cabinet. And I just sort of thought, oh my God, the right the right must draw from this the conclusion these people will never fight back. There's nothing, they just won't fight back. We just have to bide our time and wait until we're in a position to do the job, but they're not going to challenge us. And I'm afraid the right was completely correct. And that's really sad and really, really, in a certain way, pathetic. And it's a great tragedy in terms of British working class politics. And it speaks to something that's international as well.
We certainly have our work cut out for us.
And we do that. We do that.
Well, it's been great having you on the show, John. As I said, you've spent decades fighting poverty in this country, and I mean it quite honestly, not just from the bottom of my heart, but from objectively to say, you've recently retired, and all I can say is thank you for the work that you've done over the years. Our society is better for it. Your work concretely has raised people up, and you've been an inspiration certainly to me and many others. So I would just have one last question to new activists and people that are just entering the movement. If you had, say, 3 good pieces of advice, what would they be?
Well, I think that I think that people now getting active in movements and in struggles do perhaps need to really think about the point I began with in some ways, the incredible change situation, what's really possible in this period, to not underestimate the enormous change that has taken place globally and here in Canada in terms of what the possibilities are. I also think that we need to understand the incredible volatility of the period, the fact that there may be contradictions, that there may be big disappointments, there may be huge setbacks, and there may even be some very major defeats. Uh, but I think more than anything, I think you need to set your sights on the notion that we cannot, as the working, never mind the working class, the human species and all the other species on this planet can't continue to live under this system of destructive greed and irrationality. So fight for the immediate and the practical. Be involved in all those struggles very urgently, but set forward a bold vision of a different kind of society that is not based on profit and greed, but that is based on human solidarity, human cooperation, and that is that advances a clear socialist vision. Put that forward and live by it, and carry on with the struggle. And that would be my goal. And I'd finally like to say thank you very much to you personally, Mike. Thanks to all your struggles. And there is a place in my heart for the struggles of postal workers in Canada. There's been some of the most important working class struggles that have taken place in this country, a landmark and a precious resource that we all live with. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and posties aren't done yet. I'm sure they have some big fights in front of them. Thanks for coming on the show, John. We'll be in touch.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Take care, mate. Bye.
So, John Clarke from the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. Join me next week on the show, same time, 8 p.m. Thursday, December 17th. We'll be discussing with Nicholas Thompson, the host of Union Matters, the television show. Longtime fighter, both within the union movement and outside of it, for anti-racism struggles. He's recently been involved in a class action lawsuit against the federal government for anti-black racism in the public service. We'll be talking to Nicholas Thompson next week and hope to see you then.